June, under a sky so bright it hurt to look at, and the Wycliffe garden had been transformed into something out of a storybook. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, roses climbing every trellis, a string quartet sweating politely beneath the shade of ancient oaks. And somewhere inside that beautiful picture, Miss Eleanor Wycliffe stood with a silver tray of champagne flutes balanced in hands that would not quite stop trembling. It was her little sister's wedding day. 19-year-old Livia, golden as a fairy tale princess, was minutes away from marrying a viscount. Their mother fluttered nearby, all satisfied tears and nervous hands. Their father stood silent, calculating which debts this match would finally erase. And Nora, 28 years old, clever, practical, and thoroughly past her prime by society's unforgiving standards. She was doing what she always did, smiling, studying, staying out of the way. She moved toward the rose arbor, seeking a moment's quiet, a single breath away from the performance of celebration, when she heard a voice she recognized from 100 whispered stories. Deep, bored, dangerous. Gabriel Thorne, Duke of Evermere. He stood just beyond the roses, speaking to another man, and he did not know she was there when he laughed softly and said the words that would shatter everything. The elder sister is a lost cause. 5 seasons and not one offer. Nature clearly spent everything on the pretty one. The champagne glass trembled in Nora's hand. She had swallowed insults before, had learned to let cruel words wash over her like rain, to build walls of quiet dignity around the tender places where hope used to live. But something that had been carefully contained inside her for 5 years, something built of every dismissal and every pitying glance and every dance left unpartnered, cracked open. She stepped around the roses, lifted her hand, and slapped the Duke across the face. The sound echoed through the garden like a pistol shot. The entire wedding stopped breathing. Now, before we continue with Nora's story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel around the world. Thank you. The storm broke as the Wycliffe carriage lurched away from the garden. Fat drops of rain hammered against the windows like the tears Lady Helena refused to shed in public, but now released in great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Nora sat pressed into the corner of the carriage, her palms still burning from the impact, watching lightning fracture the darkening sky, and thinking how fitting it was that the heavens themselves seemed to mirror the destruction she had wrought. Livia sat opposite in her wedding gown, yards of cream silk crushed against the seat, because there had been no time to change, no time for anything after the guests had scattered like startled birds, and Lord Carroway had bundled his new bride into the carriage with barely concealed fury. Sir Robert Wycliffe had not spoken a single word since they departed, his face a mask of such profound disappointment that Nora found she could not look at him directly. "You have ruined everything," Livia hissed, her beautiful face contorted with rage. "This was my day, my wedding, and you could not bear to let me have even this one moment of happiness without making yourself the center of attention." Nora felt something cold settle in her chest at her sister's words. Before she could respond, their mother turned on her with eyes red from weeping. "What possessed you, Eleanor? What madness took hold that you would strike a duke? A duke, before half of London society." The words tumbled out of Lady Helena in a torrent of despair and disbelief. Nora's voice emerged steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. "Did any of you hear what he said about me? Did any of you care to ask why I might have been driven to such an action?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "And so she told them," repeated Gabriel Thorne's words with cold precision. Watched her mother's face shift from fury to something more complicated. Watched her father's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Still, it changes nothing," Lady Helena said at last, her voice hollow now. "You have destroyed yourself utterly. No amount of provocation justifies striking the Duke of Evermere in public. By morning, every drawing room in London will know what you did, and we shall be fortunate if we are not all cut from society entirely." Father spoke then for the first time, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You will go to your Aunt Agatha in Somerset until this scandal dies down, if it ever does. You will leave within the week, and you will stay there until I send word that you may return." Nora nodded, feeling strangely light, as though some heavy chain she had not known she was carrying had suddenly fallen away. Through the rain-streaked window, she could still see the garden in the distance. And somewhere in that chaos of scattered guests and overturned chairs stood Gabriel Thorne, utterly motionless as the storm drenched him, his hand pressed to his cheek. Something in his stillness struck her as deeply strange. The last image she had of him before the carriage rounded the corner was of a man who looked not angry, but utterly bewildered, as though she had spoken to him in a language he was only beginning to understand. The moment replayed itself in Nora's mind with devastating clarity as the carriage wheels rattled over cobblestones. She had been standing behind the rose arbor, close enough to smell the heavy perfume of late-blooming flowers, close enough to hear every word with perfect, excruciating precision. Gabriel Thorne had arrived late to the ceremony, as dukes were permitted to do. He moved through the garden with the kind of casual authority that parted crowds without him having to ask. Tall, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked carved from marble and eyes that assessed everything they touched with cold calculation. His coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat precisely arranged, and everything about him screamed wealth, power, and absolute certainty in his own superiority. She had watched him from her position near the refreshment table, wondering idly what it must be like to move through the world so utterly convinced of your own importance. And then Lord Carroway had approached him, Sebastian's nervous laughter carrying across the lawn as he tried to ingratiate himself with his new cousin by marriage. "The family is quite respectable, I assure you," Sebastian had said, gesturing vaguely toward where Livia stood surrounded by well-wishers. "The younger daughter is a gem, as you can see. The elder—" He had trailed off with a laugh that made Nora's skin crawl. Gabriel's voice had been utterly bored when he responded. "The elder sister is a lost cause. 5 seasons and not one offer. Nature clearly spent everything on the pretty one. One can only assume she compensates with wit, though I cannot imagine any amount of cleverness sufficient to overcome such unfortunate circumstances." The words had landed like physical blows, not because they were new. She had heard variations of them whispered behind fans and murmured in retiring rooms for 5 years. But hearing them spoken so carelessly, so cruelly, by a man who did not even know her name, something inside Nora had simply broken. She had stepped around the roses without thinking, her vision narrowed to a single point of focus. Gabriel Thorne's face, registering mild surprise as she approached. His hand, lifting slightly as if to dismiss her before she could speak. She had not spoken. Her palm connected with his cheek with a crack that seemed to echo off the garden walls. For one perfect, crystalline moment, the entire world had gone silent. Gabriel stood frozen, one hand rising slowly to his face, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been respected before settling on bewilderment. Then the gasps had begun. Lady Helena's shriek of horror. Livia's furious, "Eleanor, what have you done?" Sir Robert's face drained of all color as every eye in the garden turned toward them. And Nora, standing there with her hand still raised, had felt something she had not felt in years. Alive. The week that followed the wedding passed in a fog of recriminations and hurried plans. Lady Helena had taken to her bed with a headache that showed no signs of abating. Sir Robert spent long hours in his study, writing letters to relatives and business associates, trying to assess the damage to the family's reputation. Livia refused to speak to Nora at all, communicating only through frigid silences and slammed doors. The decision to send Nora to Aunt Agatha had been made within 3 days. There was no other choice, really. London society would need time to forget, if they ever would. The scandal sheets had already begun printing veiled references to a shocking display of violence at a recent wedding and the desperate measures of unmarriageable daughters. The journey to Somerset took 2 days by hired coach. Nora watched the landscape shift from London's grey stone to rolling countryside, feeling with each mile that she was shedding some heavy skin she had worn for too long. Aunt Agatha's cottage appeared around a bend in the road like something out of a children's story. Roses climbed every available surface, their blooms so abundant they seemed to be holding the structure together. The garden had gone magnificently wild, delphiniums and foxgloves and hollyhocks growing in glorious chaos. Before Nora could even knock, the door flew open to reveal Aunt Agatha herself. Silver-haired, ink-stained, with a fat orange cat named Wellington draped across her shoulders like a living shawl. "My dear scandalous girl," Aunt Agatha declared, pulling Nora into an embrace that smelled of lavender and old books. I have been waiting years for someone in this family to do something truly interesting. You have exceeded all my expectations magnificently." Nora found herself laughing, a sound that startled her with its unfamiliarity. She allowed herself to be drawn into the cottage's warm chaos of mismatched furniture and towering stacks of books and windows that looked out over gardens gone beautifully wild. Over tea served in chipped cups that had once belonged to a countess, Aunt Agatha told Nora the story she had never heard. How 40 years ago she had refused to marry the earl her father had chosen, had thrown a glass of wine in his face when he tried to kiss her without permission, and had been sent to this very cottage in disgrace. "I never left," Aunt Agatha said with a smile that held no regret. "I discovered I rather preferred my own company to the suffocating performance of society. And your Uncle Edmund, God rest him, found me here 10 years later and loved me precisely because I was ungovernable." That night, Nora began a journal. The first entry was written by candlelight while Wellington purred at her feet, and she found herself pouring onto the page all the things she had never permitted herself to feel. The rage and the relief and the strange hollow ache of not knowing whether she had destroyed her life or finally begun to live it. For the first time in years, she could breathe. 3 weeks had passed in Somerset when the letter arrived. Nora had fallen into a rhythm at the cottage, helping Aunt Agatha tend the chaotic garden, reading voraciously from her aunt's extensive library, and filling page after page of her journal with thoughts she had never dared speak aloud. She was sitting beneath the old apple tree when Aunt Agatha appeared at the garden gate with 2 letters in her ink-stained fingers, her expression one of barely contained delight. "One from your father," Aunt Agatha announced, "and one that came enclosed within it, sealed with a crest I recognize rather well. A raven clutching a rose in its talons. The arms of the Duke of Evermere." Nora's hand trembled as she took the letters. Her father's note was brief and bewildered, stating only that the enclosed letter had arrived at the London house with a request that it be forwarded to Eleanor immediately, and that he could not fathom what his grace could possibly want. Nora broke the Evermere seal with fingers that felt oddly numb and unfolded heavy cream paper to find handwriting that was bold and angular. "Miss Wycliffe," the letter began. "I find myself in the unprecedented position of composing an apology for words I spoke without thought and cruelty I dispensed without cause. Which is to say, I have written and discarded 7 versions of this letter, and none of them have adequately expressed the depth of my regret for what I said about you at your sister's wedding. The words I used were unforgivable, born of my own bitter discontent, and directed at you for no reason other than that you were present and I was determined to find fault with something. Your response, while shocking, was entirely warranted, and I have spent the past 3 weeks examining why a single slap from a woman I had wronged so grievously has unsettled me more than any event in recent memory. I write not to excuse my behavior, for there is no excuse, but to request the opportunity to apologize to you in person, to look you in the eye and acknowledge the harm I caused. I ask your permission to call upon you at your aunt's residence in Somerset. I await your response with more anxiety than I care to admit. Gabriel Thorne, Duke of Evermere." Nora read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding with an emotion she could not name. Something between fury and bewilderment, and a dangerous flicker of curiosity. "How delicious," Aunt Agatha murmured, reading over her shoulder without apology. "What will you tell him?" Nora folded the letter with deliberate care and spoke the only word that made sense. "No." She wrote her refusal that evening, keeping it brief and formal. She thanked him for his apology, but declined his request to call. Some wounds, she wrote, were best left to heal without reopening. 5 days later, she was reading in the garden when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on the lane. She looked up to see a magnificent black stallion approaching, its rider instantly recognizable by the rigid set of his shoulders and the dark coat that seemed absurdly formal for a country visit. Gabriel Thorne had come anyway. "I said no," Nora declared before Gabriel had taken 3 steps toward the cottage gate, the words sharp enough to make him pause mid-stride. "I refused your request to call, and yet here you stand as if my answer were merely a suggestion to be discarded at your convenience." Gabriel Thorne had the grace to look momentarily uncertain, a crack in the cold facade she remembered from the wedding. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she remembered, rougher around the edges. "I am aware that my presence is unwelcome," he said. But I could not content myself with a written apology when what I said to you deserves to be atoned for face-to-face. I have come prepared to be turned away if you insist upon it, but also prepared to stay until you have heard what I came to say." He carried something beneath his arm, a book bound in green leather that she recognized with a jolt as the treatise on astronomy she had mentioned wanting in a letter to Charlotte months ago. A detail so specific and so impossible that she found herself momentarily speechless. Aunt Agatha had conveniently disappeared that morning with vague murmurs about visiting a neighbor, leaving Nora alone to face this man whose signet ring caught the sunlight as he extended the book toward her. Against every instinct that screamed at her to send him away, she found herself saying the words that would change everything. "You have 10 minutes. Then you will leave and never return." The 10 minutes stretched into 20, then into an hour. Nora found herself seated across from Gabriel in Aunt Agatha's modest parlor, listening to words she had never expected to hear from a man of his position and reputation. He spoke of the pressure that had descended upon him since his wife's death 3 years prior. The relentless parade of suitable young ladies thrust before him at every gathering. The whispered speculations about whether the Duke of Evermere would ever produce an heir. How he had armored himself in coldness because it was easier to be cruel than to be vulnerable. "I married Catherine when I was 22, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to something rough and unfamiliar. "I did so because my father had arranged it, and I believed duty was the highest calling a man could answer. She was kind and gentle and deserved far better than a husband who did not love her. When she died bringing our son into the world, a son who lived only 3 hours, I told myself I would never again allow anyone close enough to wound me." Nora felt the anger that had sustained her through 3 weeks of exile begin to transform into something more complicated, something that frightened her far more than rage ever had. The afternoon light was fading when Gabriel suggested they walk. She agreed before she could think better of it, leading him through the cottage garden and into the meadow beyond, where the Somerset countryside rolled golden and green toward distant hills. They walked past wild roses tumbling over old stone walls, past the spot where Nora had been sitting when his letter arrived, until they reached a massive oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to shelter a small army. "This is where I come to read," Nora said, surprising herself with the confession. Gabriel looked at the tree and then at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "I noticed your journal when you let me into the parlor. You had it tucked under your arm as if it were something precious, and I found myself wondering what thoughts you committed to those pages." Nora studied his hands as he spoke, noting the calluses she had observed earlier, evidence that this duke did not merely sit in drawing rooms, but actually worked with his hands in some capacity. The sunset was beginning to paint the sky in shades of amber and rose when Gabriel turned to face her fully, his eyes holding none of the cold disdain she remembered from the wedding. "May I call upon you again?" he asked. "Properly this time. With your permission granted rather than your refusal ignored?" Nora heard herself speak words that would alter the course of her life. "I will consider it." She watched something that looked remarkably like hope flicker across his features before he schooled his expression back to careful neutrality and bowed over her hand with a formality that felt almost tender. "If you've made it this far in Nora's story, it means something resonated with you. Before we continue, would you do me a small favor? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. It takes 2 seconds, but means the world to creators like us. Thank you." The visits began the following week, when Gabriel arrived at the cottage carrying a worn copy of Wollstonecraft that he claimed had been gathering dust in his library. Nora suspected he had purchased it specifically for her, but she did not say so. They fell into a routine that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Gabriel would arrive in the late morning, tie night wind to the garden gate, and spend hours talking with Nora beneath the oak tree or in Aunt Agatha's cluttered parlor. They debated philosophy and argued about poetry. He brought books from his estate, and she lent him volumes from Aunt Agatha's collection. Aunt Agatha herself became a master of strategic absence, always remembering some urgent errand in the village or a pressing need to inspect the beehives at the far end of the property whenever Gabriel's horse appeared on the lane. One afternoon, Gabriel arrived carrying not just books, but roses from the Evermere gardens, their petals still wet with morning dew. "I remembered you mentioned preferring the old varieties," he said, with something that might have been nervousness in his voice. "These are from a cutting my grandmother brought from France." Nora took the roses with hands that trembled slightly, struck by the intimacy of the gesture. This man had listened to an offhand comment about flowers and remembered it days later. She began to notice other things. The way he listened when she spoke, not merely waiting for his turn to talk, but actually considering her words. The way his rigid posture would gradually soften over the course of a visit until he was leaning against the oak tree with his coat discarded and his sleeves rolled up, looking nothing like a duke and everything like a man who had finally found somewhere he could breathe. Nora found herself laughing more. Not the polite, performative laughter she had perfected in London ballrooms, but genuine amusement that bubbled up unexpectedly and uncontrolled. Gabriel's humor was dry and unexpected, emerging from behind his careful defenses in moments that caught her off guard. The first letter from Charlotte arrived 3 weeks into Gabriel's visits, full of breathless speculation and thinly veiled warnings. London is buzzing with rumors that the Duke of Evermere has been seen riding towards Somerset with unusual frequency. Lady Hortensia Drake is telling everyone you've somehow trapped him. Lady Emmeline Sinclair says it's terribly romantic. Your mother is beside herself and has taken to her bed again. What on earth is happening, Nora? The letter from Lady Helena arrived 2 days later, shorter and more pointed. Eleanor, I have heard disturbing reports about the Duke of Evermere calling upon you in Somerset. I cannot imagine what his intentions might be, but I beg you to proceed with extreme caution. Society has not forgotten the slap, and if you make another misstep, there will be no recovery from it. Nora showed both letters to Gabriel the next time he visited, watching his face darken as he read them. They think I'm playing some game with you, he said quietly. That this is revenge or sport or some elaborate cruelty. Are you? Nora asked, surprising herself with her directness. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. No. You demolished walls I spent 3 years building, and I find I have no interest in reconstructing them. The letters continued arriving in batches, creating a storm Nora could feel building even from the safety of Somerset. Charlotte's correspondence grew increasingly urgent. Lady Helena descended into barely coherent pleas for Nora to cease whatever madness has possessed you. Even Livia wrote, though her letter was more confused than angry, asking if Nora had somehow managed to bewitch the Duke who had insulted her. The theories multiplied. Some claimed Gabriel was exacting elaborate revenge, that he planned to court Nora publicly only to humiliate her. Others whispered that the clever Miss Wycliffe had trapped the Duke somehow, that the slap had been calculated to catch his attention. A few romantics suggested it was a love match, but they were shouted down by more cynical voices. Nora tried to ignore the speculation, but it burrowed under her skin like splinters. She found herself watching Gabriel for signs of deception, analyzing his words for hidden cruelty, waiting for the moment the mask would slip and she would discover this had all been an elaborate joke. The confrontation came on a gray afternoon when rain drummed against the cottage windows and made the idea of walking impossible. They sat in Aunt Agatha's parlor with tea growing cold between them, and Nora finally spoke of the fear that had been growing in her chest. Why are you here, Gabriel? What do you actually want from me? He looked startled by her bluntness. Then something shifted in his expression. A decision made in the space between breaths. I want to court you, he said, each word deliberate and clear. Properly, openly, with the intention of marriage if you will have me. I want to introduce you to my mother, present you at court, and make it abundantly clear to every gossip in London that you are under my protection, and anyone who speaks ill of you will answer to me. Nora felt the floor tilt beneath her. That's impossible. Society would never accept it. I slapped you in front of half the ton. Your reputation. My reputation is that of a cold, cruel man who uses words like weapons, Gabriel interrupted. Perhaps it's time I became known for something else. You demolished my carefully constructed armor with a single strike, and I have spent the past 2 months discovering that I prefer the man underneath. The one who laughs at your sharp observations and argues with you about philosophy and brings you roses because you mentioned preferring them once in passing. They'll say I trapped you, that I manipulated you somehow. Let them say whatever they like. I am a duke with considerable influence and zero patience for gossip. I will speak to your father next week if you permit it. I will court you properly, escort you back to London, and make it very clear whose side I am on. Nora stared at him. This man who had once called her a lost cause and was now offering to rebuild her entire life. You're serious? Terrifyingly so. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. I am not asking you to trust me completely. I know I have not earned that. But I am asking you to give me the chance to prove that what I feel is real. That you are not a game or a distraction or anything other than the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. Nora looked down at their joined hands and made her decision. Then you may speak to my father. Evermere was everything Nora had imagined and more. The estate sprawled across hundreds of acres, the main house a masterpiece of classical architecture that seemed designed specifically to intimidate visitors. Gabriel's late wife's portrait still hung in the main hall, a beautiful woman with kind eyes who gazed down at Nora with what might have been blessing or judgment. The Dowager Duchess Augusta was waiting in the blue drawing room, her spine rigid and her expression carved from ice. She looked Nora up and down with the assessing gaze of a general surveying potential threats. So you are the young woman who struck my son, Lady Augusta said without preamble. I cannot decide whether that was courage or foolishness. Both, Your Grace, Nora replied, surprised to find her voice steady. I regret the spectacle, but not the sentiment. Your son's words were cruel, and I responded accordingly. Something flickered in the dowager's eyes. Not quite approval, but perhaps a grudging respect. At least you are honest. That will serve you better than false charm if you are to survive as Duchess. Tea was a trial by fire. Lady Augusta asked pointed questions about Nora's family, her education, her understanding of what would be required of her. Nora answered honestly, refusing to pretend she had been groomed for this role or that she possessed accomplishments she did not have. I am not what you would have chosen for your son, Nora said finally. But I am what he chose, and I will not apologize for that. Lady Augusta regarded her in silence for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled. You will do, Miss Wycliffe. You will do. London was harder. Gabriel had prepared her for the stares and whispers, but the reality of walking into the opera house on his arm, while every eye in the building tracked their movement, was still devastating. Lady Hortensia Drake made her move during the first interval, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Wycliffe, how unexpected to see you here. I had heard you were rusticated in Somerset. For your health, I believe. Actually, Gabriel said before Nora could respond, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. Miss Wycliffe has been gracious enough to accept my courtship, despite my having given her every reason to refuse. And I would suggest, Lady Hortensia, that anyone who wishes to remain in my good graces might consider treating my future Duchess with the respect she deserves. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Hortensia's face went through several shades of red before she managed a strangled curtsy and retreated. The garden party at Lady Emmeline Sinclair's estate was Nora's first true test of her new position. She watched Gabriel navigate the social waters with practiced ease, watched how people deferred to his opinions and sought his approval. But she also watched Livia, standing beside her husband with a smile that didn't quite hide the emptiness in her eyes, and understood for the first time that beauty and a good match had not guaranteed her sister happiness. During a quiet moment by the fountain, Livia approached Nora with something like desperation in her eyes. I don't understand what happened, she said. You slapped a duke, and now you're to be a duchess. I did everything right, and I'm miserable. Nora took her sister's hand, feeling the brittle tension there. You're not happy with Sebastian. He married me for my face and father's connections. He has a mistress in town and barely speaks to me except when guests are present. But I'm a viscountess now, which is what mother wanted, so I should be grateful. Livia's voice cracked on the last word. You should be happy, Nora said firmly. Beauty and a title mean nothing without respect and partnership. Livia appeared at the cottage door 3 weeks later, arriving without warning in a hired carriage, her face blotchy from crying. Nora pulled her sister inside, and for the first time in years, they talked honestly. Livia confessed everything. How Sebastian ignored her, how his family treated her as an ornamental addition to their lineage, how she had realized too late that marrying for status meant nothing if she was lonely and unhappy. How she had watched Nora's scandal transform into something remarkable and felt nothing but envy. I thought you were foolish, Livia admitted. Slapping him like that. Throwing away your reputation. But you were braver than I've ever been. You refused to accept being dismissed, and somehow you ended up with a man who actually sees you. Nora held her sister while she cried, and when Livia finally lifted her head, there was something clearer in her eyes. Something that looked like the beginning of strength. What should I do? Livia asked. Figure out what you want, Nora said. Not what mother wants or society expects. What you actually want from your life. And then fight for it the way I fought back in that garden. The next morning, Gabriel arrived at the cottage with Sir Robert in tow. Her father looked older than Nora remembered, gray at the temples and tired around the eyes. But he embraced her warmly before Gabriel spoke. Sir Robert, I have come to formally request permission to marry your daughter. The words hung in the cottage parlor, heavy with significance. Sir Robert looked between Gabriel and Nora, seemed to assess the Duke's nervous formality and his daughter's quiet certainty, and nodded slowly. You have my blessing, your grace. Though I suspect Eleanor would marry you regardless of my opinion if she'd set her mind to it. Gabriel smiled at that, but when he turned to Nora, his expression was entirely serious. He dropped to one knee on Aunt Agatha's threadbare carpet, pulled a ring from his pocket, sapphires and diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, and looked up at her with everything he felt written plainly on his face. Eleanor Wycliffe, I am offering you a position that will demand much from you. But I am also offering you a partnership built on honesty and respect, and the kind of love I didn't know I was capable of until you slapped sense into me. Will you marry me? Nora looked down at this man who had insulted her and apologized to her, and slowly, carefully won her trust. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. The engagement was announced in the Times 3 days later. Society erupted into fresh gossip, but this time the tone was different. The Duke of Evermere had chosen Miss Wycliffe deliberately, publicly, with enough force to silence most opposition. Lady Augusta gave her grudging approval. Charlotte sent a letter full of triumphant exclamation points. Even Lady Helena managed a tremulous note of congratulations. The wedding preparations began. The wedding day arrived with perfect autumn sunshine, the kind of golden light that made everything look like it had been painted by an artist obsessed with happiness. Nora stood in the chamber at Evermere that had been prepared for her, looking at herself in the mirror and barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Her gown was cream silk with delicate embroidery, chosen not to make her disappear, but to make her visible. Her hair was dressed simply, with small roses tucked into the curls. Charlotte stood beside her, adjusting the fall of her veil with hands that trembled slightly. You look beautiful, Charlotte said softly. Not because you've changed, but because you're finally letting us see who you've always been. Nora smiled at her friend, at the woman who had believed in her worth even when society wrote her off. Thank you for never giving up on me. The church was filled with everyone who mattered. Aunt Agatha in the front row with Wellington somehow smuggled in beneath her shawl. Sir Robert walked Nora down the aisle with pride rather than resignation. Lady Helena dabbing at tears that seemed to be actual joy rather than performance. And Livia, sitting with her husband, but looking at Nora with something that might have been hope that she could find her own courage too. But Nora only had eyes for Gabriel, standing at the altar in his formal coat with an expression that made her breath catch. His eyes never left her face as she walked toward him, and when she reached his side, he took her hand with fingers that shook slightly. Hello, he whispered. Hello, she whispered back. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows that felt like promises they had already been keeping. To honor and cherish, to stand beside each other in triumph and difficulty, to build a life that was theirs rather than society's expectation. When Gabriel slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, Nora felt something settle into place that she hadn't known was missing. The wedding breakfast at Evermere was lavish, but somehow intimate. Gabriel kept Nora's hand in his even while they greeted guests, a silent declaration that she was not an obligation, but his choice. They danced their first waltz while the sun streamed through the ballroom windows, and Nora thought about how far she had traveled from the woman who had faded into walls at her sister's wedding. What are you thinking? Gabriel asked as they turned across the floor. That I slapped you 4 months ago, and now I'm a duchess. It's absurd. That you slapped me 4 months ago, and now I'm the luckiest man in England. It's miraculous. Months passed. The scandal of their courtship faded into legend. The story of the woman who had slapped a duke and somehow won his heart, becoming a favorite tale at society gatherings. Lady Augusta thawed degree by degree. even going so far as to tell Nora one afternoon that she reminded her of herself in younger days. Stubborn, clever, and utterly unwilling to be dismissed, Livia visited more frequently, slowly finding her own voice and beginning to demand more from her marriage. Charlotte became a regular guest at Evermere, her friendship with Nora deepening into something that felt like sisterhood. And Gabriel transformed from the cold duke everyone had feared into a man who laughed openly, who consulted with his duchess on estate matters, who was known for defending anyone society tried to cut down. He remained formidable when necessary, but the armor he had worn for so long gathered dust while he lived as the man he had always wanted to be. One evening, sitting in the library with Gabriel reading beside her and Wellington purring on her lap, Nora thought about writing a final entry in her journal. A message to any young woman who had ever been told she was too plain, too clever, too old, too much, or not enough. If you have ever been the one overlooked at the edge of the room, the one who learned to make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for you, the one who swallowed your voice and your rage and your desires because you were told that wanting more was unseemly, let me tell you something. Sometimes the moment you stop staying quiet is the moment your story finally starts. I spent 5 years fading into wallpaper, accepting that being sensible and practical and plain meant accepting a life of service to other people's happiness. I learned to smile through cruelty and lower my eyes when men looked through me instead of at me. I became an expert at diminishing myself. And then one day, standing in a garden full of people who had never really seen me, I heard one insult too many. I stopped accepting. I stopped shrinking. I struck back. It cost me everything I had been trying to protect. My reputation, my family's good opinion, my tenuous place in a society that had never really wanted me anyway. But in losing everything, I found myself. And eventually, I found a man who loved the person I discovered when I stopped performing for an audience that was never going to applaud. Your story might not involve slapping a duke, but it might involve speaking up when you've been taught to stay silent. Walking away from something comfortable but soul-destroying. Demanding to be seen and heard and valued for exactly who you are. The world will tell you that this is too risky, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging you can gather. That wanting more makes you difficult, demanding, impossible. Let them say it. And then do it anyway. Because sometimes the life you're meant to live only begins when you finally stop accepting the life everyone else planned for you. With love and solidarity. Eleanor Thorne, Duchess of Evermere. And that's where we'll leave Nora and Gabriel. Building a life that began with a slap and transformed into a love story that defied every expectation society tried to force upon them. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you're part of something special. Now it's your turn to act. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not tomorrow, not later, right now. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the slap? The proposal? The moment Nora finally stopped shrinking? We bring you stories like this every single day. Stories of courage, transformation, and people who refuse to accept the lives others tried to force on them. Subscribe so you never miss one. Thank you for spending this time with Nora's story. Thank you for believing that overlooked people can have extraordinary lives. And thank you for being here. Until tomorrow's story. Stay bold, stay brave, and never apologize for taking up space. Now subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.